in the military, national defense, those that go above and beyond to protect us all every single day. So I salute you all and say simply thank you on behalf of this incredible country that we all call home. But thanks for all that you do. And so many people just have no idea why we enjoy the things that we do, but it's because of people like you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be your host this afternoon. This is in a lot of ways, a very historic event because it's the first time that I remember that so many of our local veterans and military organizations, advocacy groups, maybe best put, have joined forces to present a series of programs that cover events that shape our world today. And oh my gosh, after the pandemic and what have you that we have endured the last year and a half, it's a changing world. But thanks to people like you, maybe we can get it back the way it should be. You'll hear more about all of that in just a moment, but first of all, what we'd like to do is start our program with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, led by Bob Epstein, and then the Texas Pledge, led by our young lady that you'll meet a little later on, Sarah Spivey, and the invocation this afternoon delivered by Barry Brown. So, ladies and gentlemen, you're already standing. We appreciate it. We'll start with our pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Honor the Texas flag. I
pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Join me in prayer, please. Almighty God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather together, to enjoy food and fellowship with friends. We ask for your blessing upon this gathering. May all that takes place here be pleasing to you and bring glory to your name. We pray for the leadership of our nation, that they would seek your wisdom. We pray for the safety of those who wear the cloth of our nation, who stand and watch at all hours in defense of the freedom and values that we hold dear. We ask particularly for your blessing and protection for those who go in harm's way this day. Bless our speaker as he brings us knowledge and insight that directly affects our well-being as Americans. For the challenges that lie ahead of us, we put our trust in you alone, Father. For the countless blessings you've given us as individuals, as a community, as a nation, we give you thanks and praise. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Thank you all. Please be seated. Well, as I mentioned at the top, we're very happy to have such a great crowd, and we again welcome you all. Thank you so much for spending your Sunday afternoon with us all. We have a number of retired general and flag officers, as well as many veterans, so we thank all of you as well for your service and your continued involvement. We also have some elected officials that I'd like to recognize by name. Henry Lesner, he is the Fairview Mayor. And Greg Custer, who's on the City Council here in Fairview. And before we move on, it's sometimes the case that a lot of times we miss out on a couple elected officials. Is there anybody else in here that I should introduce? Anybody else that we might have missed? Okay, gentlemen, thank you for all you do every single day for the community. We appreciate your being here today. Thanks so much. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned earlier, this is a joint effort. In military parlance, the term joint has a special meaning. It's the combined use of forces from more than one military service to achieve objectives that no single service could really achieve alone. Today, we have a joint effort of the Dallas chapter of the Military Order of the World Wars, the Navy League, the Jewish War Veterans, and the Air Force Association to present a series of programs and issues that we all, as Americans, are certainly interested in every single day. There is strength in numbers, and we're well served by consolidating our efforts because, well, we have different organizational programs and certainly objectives. At the macro level, we all support the same things. This series actually has two objectives now. The first is to conduct a series of discussions about key national defense issues, led by substantive subject matter experts. There are any number of models, but we decided to do it geographically today, starting with what many folks believe is our most pressing national security issue today, Asia Pacific and the Chinese competition in the region. After that, we'll do Middle East. That's coming up on September 12th. And also, a little later on, just prior to the holidays in December, on December 5th, we'll discuss Europe, Russia. We'll wrap up this round of discussions in the first quarter of 2022 with an evening event at which we'll have a concluding discussion honoring a DFW area CEO who's been a consistent supporter of veterans and, for that matter, national security. The other purpose we have is to conduct a long-range capital campaign to support the charitable and veterans work of our partner organizations. Now, following the discussion, we'll hear from each of the sponsor organizations explaining what they do and why you should support their work. We've designed a sponsorship structure that will hopefully, well, certainly something that you will consider as we go forward. And Ted Puchaz will explain that structure. All these groups are 501c3s, nonprofit organizations, so your sponsorships are tax deductible. So it's kind of a win-win situation, certainly. So today, for this kickoff event, we're honored, certainly honored, to have with us Admiral Pat Walsh, who will discuss U.S. security issues in the Pacific. And in just a minute, I'll turn over the mic to General Campbell, who will introduce Admiral Walsh and moderate the discussion. But first, what I'd like to do is I'd just like to say a few words about our agenda. Now, Admiral Walsh will provide his presentation, and then as time permits this afternoon, we'll have a little Q&A, a little question and answer, followed by a few words from our sponsors. Now, during the presentation, we will have a table with coffee, tea, and water, as well as an open bar in the back of the room, so feel free to get a beverage during the presentations, but as always, we ask that you show courtesy and be polite as best you can, keep it down so that as their presentation moves on, we don't disturb them. You can use a drink ticket if you purchased one, or for that matter, you can use cash or a credit card. Now, after we hear from our sponsors, we'll transition into a cocktail hour with hors d'oeuvres and a no-host cash bar. And we want to use this as an opportunity to network and talk with our guest speaker and certainly the representatives of our sponsoring organizations that have joined us here this afternoon. And you'll also notice that they all have membership tables around the room, so please stop by, pick up their material, and please consider the sponsorship opportunities that Ted will explain. And finally, we'll have a, believe it or not, special door prize a little later on. Oh, it's a beauty. No, I'm serious. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. So that means don't leave early, okay? Yeah. All right, now let's move on. It's now my distinct honor to turn the mic over to John Campbell. General Campbell is the president of the Dallas chapter of the Air Force Association, one of our event sponsors this afternoon. So as they say in the big time, let's call him to the podium and really give it up.
Scott, thank you. You know, you folks know that Scott is a regular fixture at events around the community, and he always adds that professional touch to events that are put on by amateurs. And that's truly what we are. So, Scott, thank you so much for the time and effort that you put into this. So as Scott said, I'm John Campbell. I'm the president of the Dallas chapter of the Air Force Association, one of the four organization sponsoring this, and it's my honor to introduce the guest speaker today and moderate the discussion. I want to just a couple of words about the Q&A session. Can you put up the Q&A slide, please? All right, while we're getting it up there, we're going to have a Q&A session after the end of the presentation. I'm guessing that with the topic we have today, there will be a lot of questions you'd like to address to our speaker. So there are three ways you can do that. The first one is, if you have your cell phone handy, you can actually email a question to NDBS, National Defense Briefing Series, ndbs.questions@gmail.com. I've got that inbox open, and I will watch those questions and be ready to pass this on to the speaker. And you can do that any time during the presentation. The second way is, on each table, there are 3x5 index cards. You can take one of those, write your question on the card, hold it up, and we got a couple of runners who will find that, spot that card, bring it to me, and then I'll relay that to Admiral Walsh. Finally, if we have time, and you'd like to ask a question in person, hold up your hand, be recognized. We'll have a couple of microphones around the room. We'll bring you a microphone and you can ask your question. Please wait until you get the microphone so we can get it recorded. And please be courteous. Remember, this is not your speech time. This is the time to ask a question. So that our guests throughout the series can speak freely and openly during the series, we have a non-attribution policy, which basically means you don't attribute any remarks you hear to a specific speaker. We are recording the program, and once we have that cleared by the speaker, we'll post that to you so you can take a look at it. We think that will encourage a free and open discussion. We ask you to observe that. So we're privileged today to have Admiral Pat Walsh with us to talk about contemporary security issues in the Asia-Pacific region. Recently, Admiral Phil Davidson, who was the past commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, said in his testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee, he said, you know, we have in this AOR, Air Responsibility, we have some of the most controversial, consequential issues for America. China, Russia, North Korea, and violent extremist organizations. And Admiral Walsh is well qualified to discuss those issues, and I'm sure he will. His last assignment, he was the 59th Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and before that served as the 35th Vice Chief of Naval Operations. As the Pac Fleet Commander, he directed naval operations on over 180 ships and submarines, 1,500 aircraft, and 125,000 sailors and Marines in an area of operations that covered half of the Earth's surface. He served as the Naval Component Commander for what is now the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is the Joint Command of Operational Responsibilities in that area of the world. Admiral Walsh is a Dallas native, attended the U.S. Naval Academy, and served with the U.S. Navy's Flight Demonstration Team on the Blue Angels. And in fact, you can see his F-18 aircraft on display at the Frontiers of Flight Museum in Love Field, and it has his number on the tail in commemoration of his service with the team. So Admiral Walsh, thank you for joining us today, and if you'll approach the podium, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. A lot of familiar faces in the audience. We had a chance to meet some of us at the Dallas Military Ball. How many military ball participants are out here? Thank you for doing that. Thanks for reminding the community of the value and the importance of veterans. The last time I attended, we recognized Sam Johnson and Ross Perot. Fantastic opportunity to recognize a couple of giants that had been steadfast in their support for veterans. The role I played was to be able to introduce and talk about both of the gentlemen, their biographies, as well as what they'd done for the community in the years since they had actively served. When that speech was over, it was probably one of the highlights of my life, and there was really nothing that has ever come close to it because you're standing with giants. I walked out of the hotel where we were, and I was standing on the curb just sort of waiting for the car, thinking about the night, when I noticed out of my peripheral vision that there was someone coming that was sort of pointed in my direction. Now mind you, there's a whole audience of people who are starting to overflow out into the sidewalks and the curb. A lot of active duty people supported from the community. And I thought, well, for sure, this is someone that has a conversation they want to have, probably with someone that's on active duty. So I stepped over to the right and allowed for this person to continue to come and probably engage in a conversation with one of the veterans or one of the active duty members. She made a correction. And one of the benefits of being a fighter pilot is you can recognize constant bearing and decreasing range. So I'm going to have a conversation, and I'm in my full mess dress, which for the audience, it's a navy blue, what we wear for formal occasions, bow tie, medals, stripes, the whole thing. And I thought, okay, She wants to talk about someone that she knows that has served in the service. And those conversations are great, but there's so many folks on active duty, and I'm in a retired status. I'm just going to let her have that conversation with someone else. So I stepped to the right and thought for sure that she would pick up on another target of opportunity out there. And she did not. She made a correction. So I thought, okay, we're going to have a conversation about the uniform. We're going to talk about medals. We're going to talk about what I did in service. All of those are great conversations, but I thought, surely someone else here can have that conversation with her. Again, I'm trying to maneuver my way away from what I see is coming because I've just been with Sam Johnson and Ross Bro. I mean, you can't do any better than that. And she made a correction. She walked up to me, looked me straight in the eye with words that I'll never forget. She said, "I parked in valet. Here are the keys." So I went home that night and I said, "Honey, we could have had a Jetta." So here we are in one of the most veteran-friendly places in the planet, and yet all around us are people who don't really recognize us, who don't really know us, and even when we're there in full regalia, still don't recognize and can distinguish someone who had served for 35 years in uniform and the bellman. So we're going to go through a conversation here about laying out the facts in the Pacific, because having a baseline understanding of just where we are and the issues that we're up against, and the sacrifices and the treasure that was expended in the course of World War II to create the environment that has allowed for economic prosperity, but also the same environment that now allows historic tension to come to the surface in ways that most of us here are oblivious to as to why history matters. Why all this tension, that 150 years of shame that the Chinese like to talk about, why that matters in today's conversation. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So let's try and lay out a contextual understanding of the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific area of responsibility. You cannot go one step into the Pacific without being reminded in some way, shape, or form of the impact of history. It's all around you. And to think that you can come in and just set history aside and try and pick up in 2021 and have a conversation about where we are today without recognizing the historic roots to the arguments and to the friction that exists in the area, you won't get anywhere. Challenges and opportunities. In the post-World War II framework, after all of that treasure was expended, we set up a system that's often referred to in shorthand today as the rules-based system. It was an idea based on a lens that we, the winning and the Western powers, looked through in order to have access to economic opportunity, access for political opportunity in the sense of recognizing the roles that individuals play in society and granting them the inalienable rights that we have recognized and we have fought through and we have churned through from our own perspective. But that unlocks the true potential of people and their ability to make contributions. There is real pressure today on the ability to maintain a leadership role that asserts that framework and defends it. There's real pressure on our ability to sustain that role that we have played historically. And yet, there's real tension within our own country as to whether or not we should continue to play that leadership role. So what's at stake? The sustainability of the U.S. role in the Pacific, whether it's a leadership discussion, whether it's a political conversation, or whether it's an economic conversation, it all converges in this point of geography. Next slide, please. So where I'd like to start, for those former veterans in the audience, how many are Army? That's what I thought. Air Force? okay, and Navy. Okay, so the Navy guys here, I'm just talking to you. All right. So you'll recognize the problem with this picture right away, which is it makes it, it's made by an Army guy. It makes it look like 70% of the world's surface is land. It's just not true. There's disbelievers out there, I know, especially at budget time, but 70% of the Earth's surface is water. The chart can be misleading. For those who don't know, this is a chart that comes out of the Unified Command Plan. It's presented to the Secretary of Defense every 2 years. What you see are the lines associated with the AOR, the area of responsibility. Inside those lines, defined by latitude and longitude, is a series of responsibilities that effectively means you represent the nation's interest in this area of your responsibility. The Pacific, the Northern Command, the Southern Command, as well as Africa, European Command, and Central Command. What's missing in a discussion like this is what's underneath the lines. Imagine what this chart would have looked like in 1946. 51 countries comprise the community of nations. Today, 196, 197, depending on how you count South Sudan, as well as Tibet, Taiwan, and Vatican City. But the point is, there's been all this explosive growth in the nation state. The very nation state concept. That's a true representation of the power of ethnicity, the power of culture, the power of individual identity. What's also reflected here, I think, is the importance of geography. Look at the Middle East. It's under the influence of 3 continents all at once, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Converges in the Middle East. And in that place where we have all these strategic resources, read oil, especially in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, a place, Straits of Hormuz, where, depending on which economic resource that you're referencing, you could see anywhere from 35 to 45 or 50% of the oil's energy reserve is coming through that strategic waterway. Critically important. The power of geography is very informative. Halford Mackinder in 1905 came up with the idea, he was looking at Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan, of the strategic pivot, meaning you could put one foot down in one place and then pivot around north, south, east, and west and find that point of geography on the ground where you could exert the most influence politically, economically, ideologically, as well as militarily. The strategic pivot in 1905 was modern day Afghanistan. So we learn from that because it helps us understand with strategic resourcing. If you had an extra dollar, where would you put it? If you had an extra ship, where would you put it? Next slide, please. So we take that idea to sea. And this is what our analysis comes up with. These are the critical choke points oftentimes referred to. These are the critical points where if we have any interruption in international commerce in any of these straits, then and what you'll see is the South China Sea in particular, where we have 70,000 container ships come through the Straits of Malacca annually. $5 trillion of economic activity. Very hard to distinguish between U.S. interests and the interest of the other 195 countries on the planet because we are so interwoven as far as the economy is concerned. The Chinese view this as their internal waters. We'll get to that. Next slide, please. So what happens now when we start to come down a level and look at individuals, how long they live, and what their economic contribution is.
So, here we go. First, an access for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an access for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. bubble show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle. But there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guangzhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
So what happens now when we aggregate that individual data? Next slide, please. You see the Asia economic miracle. Not long ago, Tokyo, Singapore, Shanghai, and look at it today. So when he describes the benefit of the rules-based system that brought economies, that brought population health to the upper quadrant, all of that's good, right? Well, you can anticipate what the next problem is going to be, the demand for resources. Next slide. So now we talk about, as Soup was describing, some of the real challenges in the Indo-Pacific area of responsibility. The busiest ports, the largest militaries, the largest populations all reside here. We can build a slide. When you look at the highways across the sea, that's what you see. That's where everybody's moving. And that slide, those numbers represent numbers of journeys per year. Next slide. So now we get into focus on what the current challenges are in an environment where we've had this very strong historic interest. The boundary disputes, in many respects, are not resolved at all. These flashpoints that we see are off the Korean Peninsula, they're in the South China Sea, they're in the East China Sea as well. We live in a proliferated world with anti-access area denial capability as far as weapons are concerned. And these technology advancements continue at a faster pace, I think, than we're able to keep up with. Now add cyber and cyber espionage to it. And what you see is we have a growing list on the list of challenges. And then our ability to keep up with what's going on in the environment is declining on the right. Next slide. So let's take a look at the economic exclusion zones. The reason why I picked this slide and watch it build here is you're going to see these are the Pacific Island countries, and nice and neat, nestled around each one of them is a circle or a shaded line. That's the economic exclusion zone. That's a 200-mile perimeter that extends off the shoreline. That gives each individual country its sovereign rights to mine and to fish and to use the economic resources that come out of the EEZ. Superimposed on top of it is the 5 degrees north and 5 degrees south of the equator. This is the area that's highly contested because it's an area with a lot of fish. And the fight for fish, the illegal use of equipment in order to fish is taking place in this region, and it's robbing countries of their sovereign economic rights and their ability to maintain and manage their own governments and their populations. But the EEZ problem is relatively simple and straightforward here compared to the South China Sea. Next. So now we're going to build the economic exclusion zones in the South China Sea. 2009-2010 timeframe is when China moved off of script. Script meaning they were hiding their capability and biding their time, waiting for some point in the future to reveal themselves. The 2008 Olympics in China had been very successful. The world was in an economic recession, and China was not feeling the effects of anything other than the tailwind associated with a very successful debut of their World Olympic team. You'll notice that as complicated as this looks, what complicates it further is the red dash line. This is often referred to as the 9-dash line that extends 1,600 nautical miles off the southern coast of China into the Straits of Malacca. When asked by the Chinese, how do they characterize the water inside this red dash line? I asked them specifically, Wu Shengli, who was my counterpart, do you view this as historic? Do you view this as territorial? No, they view this as internal. So this is internal Chinese water. All you have to do is ask for permission and you can use it. That's the Chinese view. Just anecdotally here, during this same time frame, we're at a regional symposium with Chinese colleagues who are standing up to speak. A Chinese colleague stood up and said, "Hey, forgive me for my poor English, but don't worry, we'll all be speaking Mandarin soon." Room got very quiet. Next slide, please. So when you now add another complicating factor, which is cyber, the recognition that we have a problem, but we don't exactly know how to deal with it. For those who have been involved in cyber in particular, this is an issue where there is no deterrence. There is no deterrence strategy inside the cyber domain, which means for colleagues here who have worn a uniform, it's the Wild West in cyber. So there's no sorts of clear, definitive, stated policy when it comes to the role that government will play in terms of support for the private sector. So the private sector's response to that is, we'll hack back. Well, once you do that, then there's no sort of guarantee as to what happens next. Cyber does not work in the same sort of rational approach that you would take to proportionality when it comes to how we view the targeting of innocents, or how we would use targeting in the course of, say, the Gulf War or wars subsequent to that, where we try and maintain a limited amount of collateral damage, and we serve as the moral conscience of each other, and we try to work to great effect in order to be able to represent the true virtue and principles of our country when it comes to the execution of responsibilities while in uniform. Cyber doesn't play by those rules. So you can have a cyber hack associated with a movie and then watch all the equipment at Sony Pictures go through a meltdown. And then the ATM machines go down, and then the grid goes down. So it doesn't work nice and neat. It works in an area with no rules. Next slide. So when you look at the whole of government approach that the Chinese have taken, it starts with their version of strategic communication, their direct investment, where there is a distinct quid pro quo for the investment made in other countries, their interpretation of international law we call lawfare, and then now the development of military capability. And we want to show you what that looks like. Next slide. What that looks like when trying to understand China. We tend to view China as a nation state, and we get frustrated because they don't act like a nation state. China views itself as a civilization. We view it as a nation state. So when you examine closely the role that China plays in the lives of individuals, the relationship between government and society is one that they applaud. China is actually very happy with where they are. So we were increasingly looking for what is the logic tree that helps us understand China's next move. And we end up with Chinese game theory. So we're looking at not chess, not checkers, but Go. And if you look at Go, the purpose of this game is to try and outflank opponents through the use of stones and turning those stones over to different colors. And we see those stones in geographic areas, and it helps us understand some of their game objectives. Next slide. When you superimpose it here, the idea is to exert as much pressure as you can on your opponent without firing a shot and forcing your opponent to yield. That's what we think is going on in the South China Sea. Next slide. So what this does is it sort of calls into question now our ability to recognize the withering away of U.S. influence in the region and the staying power that the Chinese are representing to our allies in the region, which is openly challenging the leadership role that we have traditionally played, and it's forcing allies in the region to hedge their bets and wonder, what's the United States' next move going to be? It's pretty clear what the Chinese next move is going to be. Okay. Yeah.
China has shown off some of the most advanced weaponry in the world with a huge military parade in Beijing. In a full display of power for its rivals, they unveiled a new range of high-tech military weapons for the very first time. One of those is this intercontinental ballistic missile that can carry up to 10 nuclear warheads and can reach the United States in as little as 30 minutes. With a range of 9,000 miles, it can fly further than any other nuclear missile in the world. Overhead, a new strategic bomber designed to project power far into the Pacific Ocean, and China's first stealth jet fighters. But the showstoppers were the weapons of the future. There was the Sharp Sword combat drone, an unmanned aerial combat vehicle that could make piloted strike fighters obsolete. This supersonic reconnaissance drone, designed to locate American aircraft carriers far out in the Pacific Ocean. And a hypersonic missile, a sleek dart that flies at more than 5 times the speed of sound, so fast it can penetrate all existing missile defenses used by the West.
Okay, so for my fellow Pentagon warriors, I did this on purpose, just so for those of you who missed the Pentagon, you could see a slide like this. For people who aren't familiar with the Pentagon, people actually get paid to put together slides like this. So let me put it to you in words. If you think of Desert Storm, the force that fought Desert Storm had the benefit of years of this chart on the left. Okay, and what this meant was it was a force designed to counter the Warsaw Pact with NATO capability. And the idea behind the frequency versus the range of military operations is that we never really expected to spend a lot of time in high-end thermonuclear warfare, nor did we plan to spend much time in counterinsurgency. So that force in the middle was called a general purpose force, and it would swing from one contingency to the next, often referred to as lesser contingencies. What happens with 9/11? 9/11 proves that 19 individuals can have strategic impact. 19 individuals put us in a position where we have spent trillions of dollars, and we had to shift our focus into the counterinsurgency fight, that low-end fight. In order to be effective in that environment, we needed all-source fusion. We needed intel. We needed to take action based on that intel. And that's why special forces became critically important, because they were agile, they were adept, they had their own distinct funding line, and they could keep up and keep pace with a threat environment that was really based on individuals and the impact individuals were having on the larger community. But the rest of the world didn't slow down. So if you look at the investment stream for Russia or for China, then you see they continue to work as far as their acquisition and procurement in a way towards peer competition. So this near peer competition and the acronyms here: anti-submarine warfare, integrated air and missile defense, cyber, surface warfare, maritime interdiction, all of these are big, high capital assets that now are on a collision course. Well, our investments had not been there. Our investments had been diluted down here in the counterinsurgency war. So the peace dividend that comes with coming out of Afghanistan prompts the realization that for 30 years we have developed a set of behaviors and patterns associated with how we sustained equipment, and we were able to simply get away with it because we had dominance in air, on the maritime environment, both on the sea and undersea. We had dominance in the electromagnetic spectrum, and we don't have that anymore because all the investments of our peer competitors, potential adversaries, call them whatever you want, Russia, China, have been in this area where they're ready to play in a way that we simply are looking at each other going, we have got to do something very different if we expect to have a deterrence strategy that deters anybody from anything. When you look at the technology advancements that have been taking place in a very proliferated world. Next slide, please. This is why we have an open bar. Go to the next slide, please. In 1989, our own declassified intelligence documents were openly claiming that because China did not have a research and development program that was fully funded, Taipei was impregnable. You don't need a fully funded research and development program when you can steal. So everything that you saw in that video, vertical launch, the guns, the weapons, everything except the white gloves and the music belonged to someone else. From the cockpit video that I've been able to examine, looking at some of the fighters, they didn't even have the decency to translate it into Chinese. They just took it in petabytes of data files and created their heads-up displays, the instrumentation. They have leapfrogged over 100 years of naval aviation experience at sea, and now they can go right to operational deployment. And although the carrier is an Indian variant, they're building their own, and the technology that they're incorporating into their own indigenous capability is up to par with where we are in terms of nuclear propulsion and our limited use of steam catapults in the future, the use of EMALS, the electromagnetic takeoff and landing system. I mean, all of that is part of now how China views developments of its own military. So in addition to the technology, we're now getting what I have here, which is the headlines. And this is just really over the course of the last 4 weeks or so. And this is just a sample. China and Russia, the guns of April. So we see real tension going on in the Black Sea and the South China Sea. This is obviously something that is a test for, for the U.S. current administration. The guns of April is a reference to, how we saw escalation in the past reach out and result in open warfare and conflict. Beijing accelerating its timeline towards Taiwan, and then its message to us to just back down. We're an equal now. So this is where we are in our relationship with China. I met in a Tier 2 dialogue with China. I was part of the East-West Institute, which is a group that really does try and work to find solutions. Tier 1, if you think of as the principles themselves, oftentimes stating positions of each country. You saw that dialogue take place in Alaska earlier in the year. Tier 2 is an opportunity to explore interests more so than positions, to see if there's any overlapping interests, if we can at least understand each other in terms of where their differences are. The Chinese view the United States as the only country in the world that could impact the future of the Communist Party in China. So they find us very threatening. The U.S. sees China as the only country in the world that, through the use of its economic levers and its pressure points, as well as its use of rare earth metals, can actually impact the quality of work and the quality of life of everyday Americans, unlike Russia, former Soviet Union, could ever hope to do. So this is the current state of where we are. At this point, I'd like to pause and be interested in your reaction to what you heard, as well as the questions that it may generate. Sue?
Okay. Real quick, that other microphone over there on the other side of the room, just make sure this on switch is on.
Testing. Chuck, would you put up that Q&A slide again, please? So, wow. Could you bring me a double? What a rich discussion, rich briefing. I know there are going to be a lot of questions. Part of the biddings have been the moderators. I get to ask the first couple of questions. But again, if you want to email me a question, I've got my iPad open in that mailbox, or get your question card out, hold it up, and the runners will come right, here's one right up front, yes. Well, where to start? So the last 20 years at least, the Chinese have, as you said, viewed that area of the world as sort of their own, and they developed a pretty robust anti-access area denial strategy with the weapons to go along with it. As much as you can, from perspective as a naval commander in the region, can you talk about the ability of the Navy to operate successfully?
Yeah. I think it's first to point out that, I joined under Nixon, I left under Obama, so I've seen quite a range as far as the political spectrum is concerned. So my comments are not directed towards one political party or another. It is an observation based on just facts on the ground. So I think we have, for a number of years, through a number of administrations, thought that if we could just invite the Chinese in, they would want to be more like us. Okay? It was called strategic reassurance, that some of the actions that we were taking were causing them to be concerned. They felt contained, therefore they felt like they needed to invest more in their respective services, military. This goes well beyond any of those conversations. We've departed that pattern a long time ago. Let's talk about when we had an opportunity to actually influence Chinese behavior. Under Bush 43, we had defense policy goals to assure, to dissuade, to deter, and defeat. We certainly didn't dissuade China from investment. In fact, they looked at what we did in the joint operating environment, and they wanted exactly that model because they saw it as being so effective. I think the last time and this is a close examination of history, last chance we had to really influence China and Chinese behavior dates back to World War I. So China participated in the sense that it provided labor to France and to England as a result of France and England's failure to meet draft quotas as World War I moved on. And China was looking for one thing at Versailles. They wanted the return of national integrity and wholeness. Remember, at the turn of the century, Boxer Rebellion, all of that had to do with the legations that had planted themselves on the Chinese mainland, used their own flag, and then went by their own sovereign rules. This contributed to the end of the emperor because it was viewed as the emperor was kowtowing to Western interests and the colonization that was taking place, the wars that were generated by opium. And it's part of that 150 years of shame that the Chinese refer to often. What came out of Versailles was not so much a concern for the Chinese interests, but a concern about the rise of power in Japan. And as a result, you may remember in the history books reference to the Washington Treaty. Washington Treaty was a series of naval treaties that were meant to try and contain the growth of surface ship capability by tonnage. That didn't work. And so the concern that the powers had at the time with the rise of Japan, which had defeated Russia in 1905 in a naval battle, was that they could see China as Japan as a future threat. And so they gave territory on the mainland of China to Japan. It was Shandong Province. Shandong Province was the birthplace of Confucius. So this was something that the Chinese held dear. It only takes a matter of months to years before you watch the birth of the Chinese Communist Party. And with that, all that followed. So when China went communist in 48, 49, the U.S. China hands, who had been advising the State Department about where China was going to go during that rebellion, were absolutely convinced that that China would become a democratic republic. And when it didn't, there was this rhetorical question asked often in the academic community of who lost China. In 1972, those same guys were pulled in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we went back to them. Our senators went back to them and said, hey, what happened to China? We thought China was going to become democratic. Why didn't it? And to a person, they stood up under oath and said, we thought we understood China, and we didn't. This is an important historic lesson that we should never forget as we try and talk to China as a nation state while it identifies itself as a civilization. It's the path to talking past each other and to understand what the Chinese interests are and to separate those interests from the interest of the Communist Party, okay, which is a Leninist government at the end of the day, versus the Chinese people who in my opinion, are not clearly in the know in terms of how much risk and how much goodwill has been lost, but how much risk that the Chinese government has taken over rocks, reefs, and shoals. You see, the one-child policy, now it's up to 2, maybe 3, but the one-child policy has not really been tested. In 1979, China invaded Vietnam. 56,000 lives, almost the same number we lost in Vietnam in 6 weeks. And that was the losses on the Chinese side. And the China view is that they actually won that because they taught Vietnam a lesson. What was Vietnam guilty of? Vietnam was working with partner nations to try and have some sort of countervailing strategy against Chinese growth and expansion. So it was talking to its neighbors in Thailand and other countries. When I look at where China is today, and I see the real fragile nature of the Chinese population in terms of its overall health and wealth, I see a growing middle class, but at the same time, I see real concern about their ability to sustain themselves, largely because of the way they've put population controls in place. It's more of a formula for a U.S. long game than it is for the short game. But the answer to your question, which is how do we operate in an environment like this? We've got to look at this in terms of having a mature enough relationship to say no. And I think that's been part of the Western problem, both on the government side, on both sides of the political aisle, as well as on the industrial side for companies that do business in China. So the big takeaway that we had in this Track 2 conversation is that the strategic and economic dialogue that would take place at the Department of State, Department of Labor, and Department of Defense level each year with the Chinese has really now dwindled in terms of its ability to influence, largely because in the past, the matters of security that we never agreed on were overridden and superseded by matters of business that everybody agreed on would be the engine that would power us through another set of talks, because no one wanted to put that business interest at risk. We no longer have that support from the business community. The Chinese are asking for these conversations now because the business community realized their data rights, their intellectual property, all of that's at risk. Trying to do business in an environment that has become increasingly coercive and increasingly difficult in order for businesses to be successful. So it's a long-winded answer to say, I think time is actually on our side, as long as we realize what we're up against. We're up against a potential adversary that doesn't play by the same rules we do. So the idea that we debate over AI, about the morality associated with decisions that come out of AI, I can guarantee you they're not having that conversation. They're going to advance artificial intelligence and machine learning in ways that advance their interests, period. And for us, I think we need to recognize that technology is moving faster than we realize, and until we come in with a stated deterrence policy and strategy that applies to cyber, that applies to the overhead architecture, meaning that if you touch this, you're going to get a reaction from us, just the same way we had a stated policy on nuclear weapons. That's our eyes and ears up there. So again, it's everything that I've described to you can be done in words and then in policy and investment that follows that.
Thank you. We have a book called 100-Year Marathon, which talks about the long-term goal of China, actually the Chinese Communist Party, by 2049, the 100th anniversary of CCP, be the preeminent power in the world within the context of not displaying their strength until the time is ready and then making a move. Would you assess that what we're seeing now is the point where they
Yes,
believe they're ready?
absolutely. President Xi has moved off of that timeline and that script. And that's why the concern about Taiwan is very real. Because, you know, in the past, I will confess, on our side, we would rationalize that they're not going after Taiwan anytime soon. So that gives us a pass to focus on matters in the Middle East. It's a little bit shorthanded, but that's what the bottom line comes to. If you look at the pattern of the way we have resource sustainment over the last 30 years, this is the pattern where we got very comfortable. Because, you know, you'll remember the language, the time and place of our choosing. Well, you don't use language like that unless you've got complete dominance in every domain, and you've got sanctuary where you can make the decisions of the time and place of your choosing. China now has a vote, and they're not waiting on us. In 2004, because of the energy in which the Taiwans were electing their leadership, China was concerned on the mainland, and they positioned all their strategic assets along the coastline pointed at Taiwan. That's 2004. They have not come off that posture since.
Here's a sort of back down to the deck plates question. The video you showed of the Navy naval operations is pretty impressive. I think we're all impressed with that. When I was in the Joint Staff, Ron Clark was a G3, was later Chief Naval Operations, and Admiral Clark said at one time, so you know, if we want to bankrupt the Chinese Navy, we've got to give them a couple of aircraft carriers. Well, they obviously didn't listen because they've got two, I believe, and the third one's on the way. What's your assessment of their ability to project power with those aircraft carriers and the rest of their naval forces? Are they a regional power or a blue water global power?
They're an untested power, the reality of combat operations. But the presence of the Chinese carrier alone in the South China Sea has got everyone in the neighborhood rattled. And we hear about it all the time in terms of the close partners and allies that are now seeing the potential to project power, not necessarily the demonstrated use of power. And then when you combine that with the way they've treated the atolls in the region, how they've built those up, and they've made those defensive positions as well, our allies, such as Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, are looking at us like, what's our reaction? So the ability now more than ever before to project power forward with forces, and that can come in a lot of different shapes and forms. I think cyber is an excellent example where we can build coalitions of like-minded countries in ways without having to feel like we're giving away anything. And so I think China's actually opened doors for us for relationships with partners if we seize the opportunity rather than retreat and come home with all of our assets.
You know, since you and I, that command has changed from Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command to recognize the importance of countries like India in that area of the world. We've kind of talked about China. Can you talk about India as a player in that region?
India has been very concerned about the submarine patrols in the Indian Ocean from China. So in the 2009, 10, 11, 12 timeframe, they would press us on the sharing of information so that they could make use of the limited assets they had, and to be able to be mindful that there was, someone in their neighborhood that was poking around, surveilling, and keeping track of Indian assets. I think it's untapped as far as our relationship with India is concerned. There's a number of issues associated with trying to do procurement and acquisition business with India. where frankly there's just a lot of bureaucracy involved and people get frustrated over that. It's at the end of the day a democracy. It may not be the democracy we like, but it's a representational form of government that recognizes the value of individuals. And I think it's important to find the right sort of relationship with them because we have a mutual interest and we have mutual assets that we want to protect.
Okay, here's a question on a different tack. I'll just read it as I got it. It says, Hoover Institute estimates the cost of the U.S. responding to COVID-19 at $6.5 trillion. Do you see incentives or rationale for Beijing to influence COVID-19 as a first strike to weaken U.S. capabilities?
After World War II, the U.S. invested in medical research units and placed them all around the world because they saw the impact of the Spanish flu influenza had on the population. So we made these investments. We had them in Jakarta, we had them in Cairo, we had them in jungles all around the world trying to get ahead of what would eventually become SARS and other diseases. Interesting, if you look at Singapore in the initial reaction to COVID, Singapore was in a really good position because after SARS in 2003, they kept the PPE. They warehoused all that stuff, which is a business decision, a resource decision that has to be made. And therefore, they were ready for the next pandemic. So their view going into this was that we're going to have another pandemic. And my view is we haven't even really launched the investigation of the origins of this pandemic. And if we think we're going to be ready for the next one, then we better understand the one that hit us. And I don't know how many trillions of dollars or lives have been impacted by this, but you know, again, we're late to need on this. I mean, this is something that should have been done and started a long time ago.
Okay. Yeah, I've got one more question for my questions. I'd like to take a few of the audience, so if you'd like to stand up and ask a question, be recognized. Hold up your hand right now and get a question up in front. No, we got it. Okay. Flash, here's the one up front. Okay, this is, I'll just network or actually add on to this. The question was, how will the Navy and the Air Force fight PRC if the network is taken down by our enemy? And I'll expand a little bit and ask specifically the ability to operate without space-based information, GPS, SATCOM, all the networks that we depend upon to leverage information. Is that something we train with in your experience every day?
It's the sort of thing that we talked about years ago when I was in uniform because we sensed a reliance on technology and single point solutions that were going to just deliver results from the battlefield. The recognition of all the critical nodes that you've just described, to me, points out the importance of being able to do MCON, dead reckoning, shoot the stars. I mean, all of that celestial navigation. Yeah, all that stuff that we used to do because we were never dependent on technology, or the technology we had we knew would fail. To rob us of eyes and ears, to rob us of the network would be, that would be really critical into the functionality of the equipment that we've got. So, not a direct answer to the question, but let me just talk about mission capability numbers, because to me, this is something that we ought to be up in arms about. GAO just recently did a study reviewing the ability of 46 platforms to meet General Mattis's then goal of 80% mission capable. Mission capable, okay? Which means it starts, it taxis, it takes off, it lands. It is not something that's going to work in this environment. It's something that could have gotten by under the post-Desert Storm environment, where you're working troop in contact, you're working close air support. 3 out of 46 platforms made the 80% goal in the 2-year period that he gave us. So we never got the conversation to full mission capable. In case there's any doubt in any veteran's mind here from what we just described, you'll be lucky if a full mission-capable platform works in this environment. But the idea of showing up without full mission capability here is hard to imagine. But that has been the product and the result of 30 years of fighting in the desert and not looking at this problem.
Okay, ma'am, any question?
Yes. Can you address the pop-up islands which China is creating?
This is something the Chinese told us to our face they would never do. Seriously. They would never militarize the Pacific atolls. And yet they have. So there's 6,200 rocks, reefs, and shoals in the South China Sea. And what they've done is they have apportioned that and through their construction efforts have made now military positions in the South China Sea. So when I showed the chart earlier about the 9-dash line that goes from the mainland of China all the way into the Straits of Malacca, 1,600 nautical miles away from their mainland. The purpose of that is to now have refueling spots where they can have their ships and their aircraft refuel, as well as they can have early warning radar and missile batteries on those islands, so they can use them for both defensive as well as offensive purposes. So that's what's going on. And despite the concern that we had, which in 2011, I advised the Philippine government that they should take this matter to the International Tribunal for a review by the Law of the Sea Commission. That judicial outcome was one that favored the Philippines when that outcome was made, saying that China was wrong to do this. And instead of running with that decision made by the International Court, the Philippines had a change of government, change of leadership, and they chose to ignore it because they did not want to upset the Chinese. So as long as we have this very intimidating sort of relationship with China, as long as China continues to have direct investment in countries in the region with the expectation that countries are going to go vote with them in the United Nations, then what we're seeing is the manipulation now of all these rules and processes that were set down after World War II that provided the economic juggernaut and brought all that economic prosperity to a place where now it's being used against us. And to stand by and just let that happen without a word said from us, I think, is appalling.
Do you think that the U.S. would have had a more proactive policy against China if Tiananmen Square would have happened?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
Do you think the U.S. would have had a more proactive policy against the rise of China if Tiananmen Square happened after World War I?
I don't know. I do know that when I look at what's happened in Hong Kong, probably a modern day, Tiananmen Square is 1989. When I look at what's happened in Hong Kong, it's sort of a modern day version of what happened in Tiananmen Square. There was a time, and that was recent, where the people of Taiwan thought the solution to the mainland problem, as they refer to it, was one where they could have one country, two systems, or one country, two systems. The Taiwans are looking at what happened in Hong Kong, and they're realizing, oh my God, how could we ever sign up for something like that? And the way Taiwan refers to what they've learned from the Hong Kong experience is they call it termites from within, because they have this full integration of Chinese capability inside their accounting, inside their businesses, inside their business relationships. And now they're so interwoven, it's hard for them to extract themselves. The concern, taking that question a step further about the Taiwan problem, is that this could very easily follow the Sun Tzu sort of proverb of being able to win without firing a shot. especially when you introduce cyber into this. So it's not as if you can imagine some sort of D-Day-like invasion from the mainland. It can happen through the financial systems. And that's why being very firm in terms of our view of representational forms of government and allies is critically important. When I spoke at the Track 2 dialogue with the Chinese, we sort of listened to 5 of them and 5 of us. Fran Townsend was part of our group. Carl Eichenberry was part of our group, who had been an ambassador to Afghanistan. And there were some other former State Department officials there. But I wanted to talk to them about vital interests. When the Chinese talk about vital interests, they talk about something geographic and sovereign in their eye. When we talk about vital interests, we talk about allies and partners. So our group responded to the Great Eastern Japan earthquake, tsunami, and radiation release. We put 20,000 sailors and Marines and airmen and soldiers at risk going to a place that lost primary, secondary, tertiary power at Fukushima power plant. This 9.1 magnitude earthquake is a 1,000-year event. It affected the tilt of the Earth's axis. It created a wave that rose to 133 feet. The epicenter was 65 miles off the coast, displaced 10 billion tons of water, moving at the speed of a jet. 400,000 homes destroyed, 20,000 lives lost, and we walked right in the middle of that for our allies. We will take risks for friends, and the Chinese need to hear it directly, and that was the message that we delivered to them. So yeah, Tiananmen, and I'm making the corollary here to Hong Kong today, those are real issues now that ought to affect the calculus of how Taiwan views itself in this broader debate.
Yes, sir. And Fletch, we have a microphone. There's a question up there. Oh, you got.
I'm not sure I can bring. A government, when you say in its full splendor, with presidents and vice presidents and senators and all of this stuff on the one side and military on the other, how does that connect to correct what seems to be a redirection for where we need to go? Who can make that call and how will it happen?
It's a fair question, and I certainly appreciate the perspective. I mean, our political leadership in the Department of Defense is the bridge between the political life and life on the ground in uniform. And it's important for them to be able to have time to assess where we are today. And where we are today is strikingly different than where we were just 5 years ago. And that's not a slam against one administration or the next. That's a view from people who have been working the issue and are genuinely concerned about the outcome. Because if it gets to a place where we actually have an adversarial relationship, an open adversarial relationship with China, I'm not sure who wins. This audience doesn't need to be reminded of what that looks like. Turner Joy and Maddox, 2 names that will be familiar to the Vietnam veterans, did not go out to start the Vietnam War in 1964. They were on what was called the DeSoto Patrol. DeSoto Patrol, passive intel collection. And they're right at the territorial limit as they go out trying to collect signals. I mean, how hard can that be? So the North Vietnamese look at that in context of all the noise that's been going on in the background between North and South. So it's not like this is the first day. There's been genuine friction for a long period of time. You know, that friction and those words really matter because it influences the judgment of people who are looking through the lens of technology to determine the intent of the other guy. So the North Vietnamese torpedo boats come out to take a look at Turner Joy and Maddox. Turner Joy and Maddox see torpedo boats coming. And at 10,000 yards, 5 miles, they fire warning shots. What does a warning shot look like from 10,000 yards? It looks like they're shooting. So they pursue. And there is some loss of life in that excursion. But everybody retreats into their corners. That night, Turner, Joy, and Maddox claim that they are under attack by torpedo boats coming out of North Vietnam. A name from history is sitting in his ready room, watching this go back and forth, and here's the call. Jim Stockdale runs up to the flight deck, pulls the young Lieutenant J.G. out of the cockpit, gets in himself into an F-8 that's filled with Zuni rockets and guns, and now is under radar control from Turner, Joy, and Maddox to go release his ordnance against these guys who are firing on the ships. He can't find them. He releases his ordnance into the dark ocean at 500 knots and 500 feet. Comes back, lands, and said, "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life. I didn't see anything out there." Goes to his stateroom, goes to bed, knock on the door at 3:30 in the morning. "Hey, you got to get up." Get up for what? You got to lead the strike. What strike? You've got to lead the reprisal raid against the North Vietnamese because of the attack last night. He said, "There was no attack last night. I was there." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the start of the Vietnam War. It's called Gulf of Tonkin. And 58,000 lives later, and an entire generation turned upside down. That's what we come back to. My greatest fear in the Pacific Fleet, while this is starting to germinate and bubble up, is that we've had a country that's been preoccupied with the desert, and they don't see how fast everything is changing. And even if they do, they want to look for a convenient way of, I don't need to address this one right now. I've got to address all these other fires that are going on. And the concern that I have is that we have gotten ourselves to a position where we are uncomfortable with ourselves being firm and saying no, that we will not allow this to happen. We will not let this happen to our friends, our allies. We will not let this intimidation take place because it impacts us in our lives. And if we have lost that ability, then we've lost the ability to lead.
It's my understanding that there is a giant internet bomb, and you can be
First of all, I don't know, and I think it's up to the people of South Texas to just manage this. I think there's a real serious element to this that I would like to address, and that's the concern that we have about the cyber networks, particularly with Huawei. These are state-owned enterprises, and as a result, there's no guaranteed protection of individual rights of citizens of the United States that do business with Huawei. So think of this as having the ability to now make the routers, to make all the connectivity of all the parts that are in place. And I think the concern in South Texas in particular is now the proximity to be able to collect intel passively from our Air Force colleagues. So yeah, it's a real threat. And we had this concern at Pearl Harbor. Specifically, there's a test range that we would have to surveil and patrol and kick out people who are coming to observe the performance of our weapon systems. And my concern specifically was the telemetry associated with that. The idea that we are now in a system that allows them to move into South Texas, of all places, is something that ought to be a real concern for everybody.
John? I noticed, I'm going to ask a question that I think for me is the elephant in the room. So we have a new administration, and I noticed when we were getting that new administration that national defense was a debate topic. That's what the investments are. And I'm wondering, I'd love to hear your opinion, you know, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and it's all going to be over mentality. What do you think this administration will do?
Afghanistan was the opportunity that we had to actually be close to China. I mean, you know, you use the South Texas example, which is a great example. It's current, it's relevant. Afghanistan was our version of that. And the idea that we're going to walk away from Afghanistan without any leverage associated with it, and that we've got our translators left behind, you know, the people who helped us. I mean, we can't get those guys out fast enough because, you know, their lives are in danger, their families are in danger. The decisions made, so, you know, where do we go from here in terms of Afghanistan is a real concern. To think that after all that blood and treasure that was invested in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and to walk away from that, the harder problem is going to be talking to the families of those that were lost, and to be able to explain and rationalize for them the decision and why it's important. My view, whether it's Iran or whether it's China, is to recognize that, number one, you have to be at the table, or you're going to be on the menu. And number two, to be there and to be a negotiating partner is critically important. To assume that we can walk away from Iraq and Afghanistan and not have things fall back to the status quo antebellum before hostilities. That's exactly what's going on. Taliban's getting ready to move, and all those gains. Think of, you know, the right for women to vote. Start there. The right for women to pursue their own education. I mean, all those rights for 50% of the population. If that's not critically important to us, then I don't know what is.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Excuse me. I'd like your opinion. China has a robust economy, and the U.S. depends on the revenue share from the United States for the military. What is your opinion if you were to buy more American products and defer the lobbyists, the Congress, from having these corporations have their major profit margins because the product falls short in China? Does that impact with the Chinese military?
I think there's a real growing effort. Starts with rare earth metals, then goes to semiconductors, that we've offshored all of this capability, and we've done so now at great risk to ourselves. $12 billion project started outside of Phoenix with the idea of bringing Taiwan Semiconductor here to build now that, to have that manufacturing capability back onshore. My specific concern about that construction site is cyber. And the real concern that we have to go into this eyes wide open, realizing this is one of the most targeted companies in the world, and we're going to bring it here. So we need to have, I think, a much different approach to the way we deal with the ubiquity of cyber. So what do I mean by that? It's convenient to be able to have the Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security, and to separate in our own mind cyber capabilities for the Department of Defense and cyber capabilities for the Department of Homeland Security. Unfortunately, the cyber world just doesn't work that way. DoD has a supply chain, it has second and third tier vendors, and that's where the cyber problem will exist. So these small businesses that don't have the ability to invest in network teams, that have the ability and the technology to police and monitor their own networks, where they're getting hit with alerts on average, 100,000 alerts a week on average, 19% they get to look at, on average 4% they can actually prosecute against, is a formula for cyber espionage and for hacking. So when I think about bringing that capability back here, I think we've got to be eyes wide open in terms of what we're walking into and the kind of threats that we're going to have to deal with.
Scott? Yeah, I normally would not stand up since I'm supposed to be working here today, as I say. But first of all, thank you for your service. Yes. Secondly, Admiral, I could write a book on what I learned here today. I'd have to look back on some notes, because I certainly don't remember it all, but it's fascinating what you've shared with us. So at the expense of sounding like a newsman, I would do this. All the incredible things that you've shared with us, above and beyond, when someone in your position does what you have done here today, and we all go back home to our respective homes tonight, as a speaker, I'm sure you and all of us will say, what's the takeaway? What did we learn from the time spent this afternoon on this Sunday? Where do we go forward? So my question to you is this. If you had to share with us all the takeaway that you would like us to be a part of and walk out these doors here later today and remember 3 things, I just wondered what those 3 things might be, and on top of that, what we as citizens, all living in the same country, what our responsibility or our duty is to move forward, to put into action one of the 3 things that you're about to share with us.
Okay, can I do 2?
Yes, sir, you can.
The summary point is that your fathers, your forefathers, invested in the ability for us to be able to do what we're doing here today. They invested with their lives in many cases. A system that they thought would guarantee freedom of movement, freedom of thinking, freedom of opportunity, freedom of assembly, freedom to be an entrepreneur and to grow the economy. We are seeing the benefit of all of that. And at the same time, we are seeing those who have benefited the most from this economic development since World War II are now using that to pull on historic heartstrings and tensions to create a situation that now turns the tables against us. Chinese are fine with a rules-based system as long as they write the rules. And I think we owe it to all that sacrifice that gave us the world that we live in today to stand up and feel comfortable about being who we are and doing what we do and say, no, we don't agree. And feel comfortable in our own skin to stand up and say, that's not the intent of this system that was created. That's not the intent to be coercive in the language that's used. And that's threatening to people who really matter to us. So that's item number 1. Item number 2. All of us here come from a different part of the world, and sometimes that means a different part of Texas. And because all of us had to really stand up in front of our neighbors, in front of our family, in front of God and country, and really just answer one question, which is, do you solemnly swear that you'll support and defend the Constitution of the United States? To the same, that you take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office that you're about to enter, so help you God. 70 words. 70 words that come down from the First Continental Congress, because contracts alone were not enough to pledge to this great experiment. Only one word of the 70 is repeated, and that's faith. To believe in something where the facts are not self-evident. If we get to a point where we lose faith in our institutions, in those who lead us, and in our fellow man, then we've lost more than we've ever realized, and we may be able to ever recover in our lifetime. Faith.
Admiral Walsh, thank you. And believe it or not, Scott's question was not scripted. It's a great way to, I think, end our discussion today. And I apologize, I have several questions we just did not have time to get to. Sit down, sit down, sit down. All right, we're not going any place yet. I want to thank you, and Scott will coming up and continue the program. We do have some more information I'd like you to stick around for. We've got that fabulous door prize that Scott talked about, but right now Scott's got a presentation to make.